My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 38 years old and I've worked for nearly 9 years as a maintenance technician for a company that services water supply systems in Arizona. I live in a small town near Flagstaff, but much of my work takes place in completely isolated locations. By then, I was already used to driving for hours through the desert to inspect reservoirs, pipelines, and pumping stations that almost nobody ever visits. It was the kind of job you normally did alone because there was no point sending 2 people to investigate a simple alarm. That morning, my supervisor called and told me that an old pumping station had been registering strange pressure drops since the previous night. The system would reset itself, operate normally for a few minutes, and then fail again. The assignment sounded simple. Drive out there, inspect the valves, check the sensors, and restart the equipment if necessary. I grabbed my service truck, loaded my tools, and left shortly after 9 in the morning. The station was in the middle of the desert, far from any town, surrounded only by low hills, dry vegetation, and miles of reddish earth. I had only been there once several years earlier, and I remembered it as an old facility built partially below ground level to protect the pumps from the extreme heat. I didn't think this service call would be any different from the many others I had handled before. After nearly 3 hours of driving on paved roads and several more miles along a narrow dirt road, I finally spotted the concrete building rising out of the middle of nowhere. The heat was intense enough to distort the horizon, and the wind occasionally swept small clouds of dust across the road. As soon as I parked, the first thing I noticed was that the access gate had already been unlocked. I assumed another crew might have stopped by before I arrived, but there wasn't another vehicle anywhere nearby. The silence also stood out. Normally, these stations produce the constant sound of pumps running and water flowing through the pipes, but that day everything seemed much quieter than it should have been. I grabbed my tool bag, adjusted the radio clip to my belt, and entered through the main door. Inside, the building was lit only by a few old fluorescent lights that flickered irregularly. The air was much cooler than outside and carried that familiar smell of damp concrete mixed with machine oil. That's when I noticed something strange in the very first room. A rolling tool cart was sitting open. A wrench lay on the floor. An inspection tablet was powered on atop a workbench. The screen was still lit, as though someone had stopped working only a few minutes before I arrived. Yet there wasn't a single person anywhere inside the facility. I walked through the first section, calling out, assuming another technician might be checking the pumps on the lower level. My voice echoed through the concrete corridors, and the only reply was the echo returning a few seconds later. I picked up the tablet to see who had been there last. The screen showed an inspection checklist that had been interrupted halfway through an examination of the main valves. It hadn't even been completed or saved. That bothered me because no technician simply walks away from company equipment like that. I set the tablet back where it had been and began following the standard inspection procedure. I went through the electrical control room, checked the indicators, and confirmed that the pressure fluctuations were indeed showing up in the system logs. Nothing seemed serious enough to explain why someone had abandoned the inspection. As I walked through the narrow corridors, I kept finding other strange signs. A hard hat left on a ladder, a flashlight still switched on, illuminating one wall, a water bottle sitting half full on top of a metal cabinet. The water wasn't even warm, meaning someone had probably been there only a short time earlier. My first thought was that maybe a technician had become sick and been rushed away. But if that had happened, someone would have notified dispatch, and my supervisor certainly would have mentioned it. I walked down the staircase leading to the underground level where the main pumps were located. The environment changed completely. The temperature dropped several degrees. The air became heavier because of the humidity. The thick concrete walls and narrow corridors caused every sound to travel in ways that were difficult to judge. The constant noise of the pumps masked smaller sounds, so I had to pay close attention while inspecting one of the valves that had been showing unstable pressure. I was crouched down adjusting a valve when I heard a metallic sound somewhere farther down the corridor. It sounded like a heavy boot stepping onto a steel grate. I immediately looked up and stood still, waiting to hear it again. I figured I had finally found the other technician. After waiting several seconds, I called out, asking whether anyone was down there. There was no reply. All I could hear was the steady operation of the pumps. I returned to work, convincing myself I had probably mistaken some noise from the piping. Less than a minute later, I heard exactly the same sound again. This time it was several slow, evenly spaced footsteps moving along the corridor just beyond the bend where my flashlight couldn't reach. Then they stopped suddenly, as though whoever had been walking had realized I was listening too. I stood staring at the corner of the corridor for several seconds, expecting someone to appear. My first reaction was to assume another employee was down there, and simply hadn't heard me over the noise of the pumps. I called out again, louder this time, saying my name and asking if they needed help. Nothing, not a response, not a movement. The only sound came from the machines vibrating through the concrete floor. I decided to walk toward the corner with my flashlight aimed ahead. As I got closer, I noticed small patches of dust disturbed across the floor, as though someone wearing heavy boots had walked through only a short time earlier. I turned the corner quickly, expecting to find someone there. The corridor was completely empty. I shined my flashlight on the doors to the mechanical rooms, opened 2 of them, and checked inside. Nothing but motors, pipes, and old electrical panels. As I did that, I felt that difficult-to-explain uneasiness that comes when you suddenly realize you're paying attention to every tiny sound around you without even thinking about it. My heart was already racing, even though I kept trying to come up with a logical explanation. I thought maybe a contractor had entered without signing in, or perhaps a security guard was making rounds through the facility. Even so, it was strange that someone would completely ignore another person, calling out in such a small place. I decided to head back upstairs and contact dispatch over the radio before continuing the inspection. It wasn't exactly a call for help. I simply wanted to confirm whether another crew had actually been scheduled for that station. I climbed the metal stairs, crossed the main room, and walked toward the exit. The moment I reached the heavy steel door leading outside, I pushed on the panic bar. It didn't move even an inch. I assumed it had jammed, so I shoved harder with my shoulder. Nothing. I tried again using both hands and clearly felt resistance from the outside, as though the door had been secured with an external locking bar. That made no sense because it had been completely free when I entered. My stomach instantly turned cold. I pounded on the steel door several times and shouted, asking whether anyone was outside. While waiting for any response, I heard a sound outside the building, slow footsteps moving across the gravel surrounding the station. They weren't running. They didn't sound hurried. They simply circled the building calmly, as though whoever was outside knew perfectly well that I couldn't get out. I kept pounding on the door for nearly a minute, alternating between shouting and trying to force the panic bar. The door had been designed to withstand tremendous pressure and open only inward, so there was virtually no chance of forcing it open without heavy equipment. I grabbed the radio clipped to my belt and tried contacting dispatch. All I heard was constant static. I changed channels, adjusted the antenna, walked to different parts of the room. Tried again, nothing but interference. Cell service also disappeared completely inside the thick concrete structure, something I had already expected. But at that moment it carried a completely different weight. I took several deep breaths, trying to organize my thoughts. There were still other emergency exits at the rear of the station. Maybe one of them was unlocked. As I walked down the main corridor toward the maintenance area, I heard those metallic footsteps again coming from the underground level. They were slow, steady, impossible to mistake for the sound of the pumps. This time they didn't seem far away. The footsteps were climbing the same metal staircase I had used only a few minutes earlier. I froze completely, gripping my flashlight so tightly that my fingers began to ache. The footsteps reached the final step and simply stopped. I waited several long seconds, staring at the staircase. No one appeared. Even so, I was absolutely certain someone was standing down there. Trying not to make any noise, I slowly backed away down the corridor without taking my eyes off the staircase. My mind searched desperately for any rational explanation. Maybe it was a trespasser using the station as shelter, someone trying to steal copper wiring, even another worker suffering from some kind of mental illness. Any explanation seemed better than admitting I was trapped inside with someone who was deliberately making sure they were never seen. I reached the corridor leading to the storage rooms and found an emergency exit. I carefully turned the handle. It was locked too. The panic bar wouldn't move at all. Before I could try another option, I heard a metallic click from the main corridor, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slowly closing somewhere inside the facility. Then came complete silence. No footsteps, no voices, only the distant hum of the pumps. That silence was worse than any noise. For the first time that day, I had the overwhelming feeling that whoever was inside the station had stopped moving, because they knew exactly where I was. I stood there for several seconds, trying to decide what to do. The worst choice would have been to keep wandering around without a plan. But staying where I was didn't seem safe either. I decided to return to the control room because that was where the station's internal security cameras were monitored. If someone really was moving through the building, maybe I could locate them on the screens. I walked slowly, illuminating every corridor intersection before moving forward. At that point, I wasn't even trying to hide my presence anymore. Whoever was inside probably knew exactly where I had been ever since the moment the door had been locked. When I entered the control room, the monitors were still on. They showed views of the outside area, the main entrance, sections of the corridors, and the yard containing the water tanks. I quickly cycled through the camera feeds. One showed my service truck parked exactly where I had left it. Another showed the entrance gate still standing open. Everything looked completely normal. I kept switching through the cameras until I noticed something that made my stomach turn cold. One camera pointed toward the main corridor showed someone walking slowly through the hallway, wearing a dark baseball cap, blue jeans, and a small backpack. The person walked past with their back to the camera and disappeared around the corner. The unsettling part was that the corridor was on the opposite side of the station, far away from where I was standing. Instinctively, I grabbed my radio again, even though I knew it didn't work. At that exact moment, I heard a sharp sound coming from outside the control room. Someone had touched the door handle. I held my breath and stared at the door. The handle slowly turned all the way downward, as though someone was testing whether the door had been locked. I hadn't locked it after coming inside. For several seconds, the handle remained fully depressed without the door opening. Then it slowly returned to its normal position. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, only silence. I glanced quickly at the monitor showing the corridor outside the control room. The hallway was empty. There wasn't a single person there. I kept staring at the screen for several seconds, trying to figure out whether there was some blind spot between the camera and the doorway. That's when I noticed a very faint reflection in the control room window. It wasn't coming from the monitor. It came from behind me, from the corridor through which I had entered. I spun around immediately, flashlight raised. No one was there. The control room door remained slightly open, exactly as before. At that moment, I made a decision that probably prevented something worse. Instead of going out to look for whoever was there, I shoved a heavy metal cabinet against the door, switched off my flashlight, and remained completely silent, waiting to find out who would lose patience first. I stayed hidden behind the control room workbench for what felt much longer than it actually was. Eventually, I looked at my watch and realized only a little over 20 minutes had passed. During that time, I heard someone try 3 different times to move the cabinet from outside. They weren't violent impacts, just short shoves, as though whoever was there was simply testing how heavy it was. Then came footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway. Sometimes they moved away. Then they returned. I avoided even taking a deep breath, afraid of giving away my position. Every few minutes, I kept trying to reach dispatch on the radio until suddenly, a very weak transmission finally came through. I couldn't hear my supervisor clearly, only a few words broken up by static. I shouted my name into the radio, telling him I was trapped inside the station and that someone was moving through the building. The transmission died immediately afterward. About 15 minutes later, I heard the sound of an engine arriving outside. Then came voices and the sound of the main door being unlocked. I pushed the cabinet away and found 2 company employees accompanied by a county sheriff's deputy entering the station in a hurry. We searched every corridor, every mechanical room, and the entire underground level. We found absolutely no one. The only unusual thing was that the main entrance really had been secured from the outside, using the heavy steel security bar that normally remained attached to the exterior wall. The same bar I was absolutely certain had not been in place when I first entered. After that day, I requested never to be assigned to that station alone again. A few weeks later, I spoke with one of the company's oldest employees, a man who had known that station since the 1990s. Without my telling him many details, he asked, "So, you heard the footsteps too?" I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He told me that over the years, several technicians had reported finding doors standing open, tools left behind, and hearing someone walking through the corridors when there was supposedly no one else scheduled to be there. There had never been any official reports of intruders because no one had ever managed to find an actual person inside the facility. The company had always dismissed the stories as misunderstandings or coincidences. To this day, I still don't know who locked that door or who appeared on the security cameras while I was trapped inside. What bothers me most is remembering that whoever it was never ran, never spoke to me, and never tried to force their way into the room where I was hiding. They simply walked slowly through the station, as though they had all the time in the world and knew that I had nowhere to go. Story 2. My name is Mason Reed. I'm 22 years old, and at the time this happened, I was in my final year studying photography at a university in Tucson, Arizona. My best friend, Ethan Collins, was in the same program, and we spent most weekends looking for interesting places to photograph. We weren't the kind of guys who broke into abandoned properties just for fun. We always tried to get permission because, besides avoiding trouble, it was important for our university portfolio. One of our professors mentioned that a massive decommissioned military aircraft boneyard allowed guided access to certain areas by appointment. After several weeks of exchanging emails and filling out paperwork, we finally received permission to photograph part of the complex one afternoon. It was a difficult opportunity to get, so we left Tucson shortly after sunrise. The drive took a little over 2 hours, and the closer we got, the more the desert seemed to swallow every sign of civilization. The heat was already intense well before noon, and the dry air constantly irritated my throat. When we arrived at the main gate, an employee checked our paperwork, explained exactly which areas we were allowed to visit, and repeatedly emphasized that we were not to enter any aircraft or cross certain fenced-off sections. It all seemed like a normal procedure, and at no point did I think that day would be any different from any other photography assignment. After parking in the authorized area, we started walking between seemingly endless rows of aircraft. I had never seen anything like it. There were hundreds of airplanes lined up side by side, some commercial, others military, all coated in a thin layer of desert dust. One of the strangest things was the silence. There was almost no wind, no nearby traffic, and sounds seemed to disappear inside that enormous space. Every now and then, all you could hear was the ping of metal expanding under the sun or the distant sound of a bird flying over the fuselages. We kept taking photographs, discussing compositions and the details of the faded paint peeling from the aircraft. After nearly an hour of walking, we noticed something that didn't fit with the rest of the place. One of the aircraft had its main door open, not just unlocked, but fully lowered, forming the boarding stairs. I assumed it might be part of some maintenance work, but there were no traffic cones, service vehicles, or employees anywhere nearby. We kept walking and found another aircraft in exactly the same condition. As we approached it, Ethan pointed to the ground beneath the stairs. There were 2 nearly full bottles of water, an opened sandwich wrapper, and a lit cigarette resting on the concrete. That definitely didn't look like something that had been sitting there for days. It looked as though someone was using that airplane at that very moment. The two of us stood there for several seconds, staring at those items on the ground without saying a word. The cigarette still produced a thin stream of smoke that drifted away in the faint breeze moving between the aircraft. Ethan was the first to speak, saying it was probably just an employee taking a break. That was my first thought too, but there was one strange detail. Since entering the complex, we hadn't seen a single person anywhere in that section. The only employee we'd encountered had remained back at the entrance gate, far from where we were. Even so, I tried not to become paranoid over something that probably had a simple explanation. I took a few photographs of the outside of the aircraft and we started walking away. Before moving to the next row, I glanced back over my shoulder without really thinking. The door was still open, but I thought I saw a shadow move quickly deeper into the cabin. I couldn't make out a person or any details, just a quick movement disappearing into the darkness. I stared for several seconds, trying to see more clearly, but the contrast between the bright desert sunlight and the dark interior of the aircraft made it impossible. Ethan asked what I was looking at. I told him it was probably just my eyes adjusting to the light. We both laughed about it and kept walking, although I was already paying much more attention to our surroundings than to the photographs. During the next 40 minutes, we encountered several more situations like that. 2 other aircraft had their doors open. A portable stairway had been positioned beside an old cargo plane. Near another fuselage, there were fresh footprints in the fine sand gathered around the landing gear. They weren't old prints distorted by the wind. They were sharp, well-defined footprints, as though someone had walked there only a short time earlier. Ethan suggested there might be maintenance crews working in different parts of the complex, but we still hadn't seen a single vehicle or heard any conversation. The silence remained almost absolute. Once we realized we had photographed everything we needed in that area, we decided to head back to the truck before the sun started getting lower. We used the same row of aircraft we had followed when entering, but walking among hundreds of nearly identical airplanes made everything look the same. After several minutes, we finally spotted our pickup truck parked exactly where we had left it. But the moment we got closer, we noticed something was wrong. The passenger door was slightly open. I was absolutely certain I had locked it with the remote before we started walking. I ran to the truck and found the interior completely ransacked. Our backpacks were still there, but both cameras, 3 lenses, and almost all of our photography equipment were gone. For several seconds, both of us simply stood there staring into the truck, trying to understand what had happened. There was no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. The doors appeared to have been opened normally. The first thing I did was check the spare key that I usually kept hidden inside my backpack. It was still exactly where I had always kept it. Ethan started looking around the parking area, assuming someone might still be carrying our equipment. There was no one. The place was just as empty as when we had arrived. I pulled out my phone to call the number the employee had given us at the entrance. No signal. I already knew reception was poor in that area, but I had expected to at least make a call near the access point. We decided to walk back toward the main gate as quickly as possible. While closing the truck door, I heard a faint metallic clink coming from one of the rows of aircraft to our right. It sounded like someone stepping onto an aluminum ladder. I immediately looked up and saw only the nose of an old airplane blocking part of the view. A few seconds later, someone appeared walking between the aircraft. The person wore a baseball cap, long sleeves despite the heat, and kept their head lowered. The moment they crossed a small open space between 2 airplanes, they disappeared behind another aircraft. Ethan saw them too. Both of us assumed we had finally found an employee, so we started walking in that direction while calling out to them. We hurried to the row where the person had disappeared. They were gone. The corridor formed by the airplanes was long, narrow, and filled with shadows cast by the wings. You could walk for dozens of yards without seeing what lay in the next row. We called out several times, explaining that our equipment had been stolen and that we needed help. There was no reply. We continued several more yards. That's when I noticed something strange. Whenever we sped up our pace, we heard another set of footsteps several aircraft farther ahead. When we slowed down, those footsteps slowed down too. We could never actually see the person because the fuselages completely blocked our view to the side. It was as though someone was walking in the parallel row, using the airplanes themselves to remain hidden the entire time. I decided to test it. I suddenly stopped walking. 2 seconds later, the footsteps stopped too. Ethan looked at me without saying a word. I think both of us realized exactly the same thing at that moment. That person wasn't simply walking through the area. They were matching our movements perfectly. Neither of us said it out loud. I think we were both afraid of confirming what we had already realized. We kept walking, trying to stay calm and avoid making any stupid decisions. Our only goal was to leave that open section of the complex and get back to the entrance building as quickly as possible. As we continued between the endless rows of aircraft, I started paying closer attention to the gaps between the fuselages. In some places, you could see only a few yards before another airplane completely blocked the view. Through one of those openings, I saw the same person again. They slowly crossed between 2 airplanes carrying one of my camera backpacks over their shoulder. I recognized it immediately because there was a small orange patch sewn onto the strap that I had stitched there myself months earlier. I instantly shouted for them to stop. The person turned just enough to look in our direction for a second. I couldn't see their face because of the baseball cap and a cloth covering part of it. Then they disappeared behind another aircraft. We ran to the place where they had crossed. All we found was another series of empty corridors. There was no way someone could disappear that quickly, unless they knew that place far better than we did. That was the moment I stopped thinking only about the stolen cameras. If someone had taken our equipment and was still moving around us, it meant they weren't simply trying to escape. We decided to stop looking for the backpacks and head straight for the exit. I roughly remembered the way and used the top of the control tower, visible in the distance as a landmark. We walked quickly, constantly looking over our shoulders. After several minutes, I began hearing that same rhythm of footsteps again, coming from the next row over. They never sped up to catch us, but they never disappeared completely either. At one point, Ethan grabbed my arm and pointed toward an opening between 2 airplanes. There was another person standing several yards ahead. For a second, I thought it was the same man. Then I realized it couldn't be. The clothing was different. And this person was much taller. They stood completely still between the aircraft, looking directly at us. Before I could say anything, I heard footsteps behind us too. I immediately turned and saw another silhouette disappearing behind the tail of an airplane. At that moment, we knew for certain we weren't being followed by just one person. There were at least two, maybe more, using those endless rows of aircraft to surround us without ever remaining in the open, long enough for us to identify them. From that point on, we simply started running. Recovering the cameras no longer mattered. We just wanted to reach the entrance building where there would at least be other people. As we ran between the rows of airplanes, the footsteps around us also became faster. I could hear them changing direction behind the fuselages, but I almost never caught sight of the people making them. At one turn, I glanced sideways and saw a man crouching behind the landing gear of an old cargo aircraft. The moment he realized I had seen him, he quietly moved behind the airplane without saying a word. A few seconds later, another person appeared farther away, crossing between two aircraft with one of my camera lenses hanging from its strap. None of them tried to speak to us. None of them told us to stop. They simply kept changing positions as we moved forward. When we finally saw the entrance fence, we started shouting before we even reached the gate. Two security employees ran toward us. At that exact moment, every movement among the aircraft stopped. It was as though those people knew exactly where the safe boundary was for remaining hidden. The security guards immediately drove into the area in a pickup truck and radioed the main office. We stayed outside trying to explain everything at once. They searched the area for nearly an hour alongside other employees, walking through numerous rows of aircraft. The only thing they found was one of my backpacks lying behind an airplane, completely empty. The rest of our equipment was never recovered. Before we left, one of the supervisors apologized for what had happened and explained that that particular section of the aircraft boneyard normally remained closed because people were able to enter through damaged sections of the outer fence. According to him, trespassers sometimes used some of the decommissioned aircraft as temporary shelters for days or even weeks before eventually being discovered. He never mentioned similar thefts, but he also didn't seem surprised when we described the open aircraft doors, the water bottles, and the lit cigarettes. The police took our report, but they never recovered our cameras or identified the people who had been there that day. What still bothers me isn't the financial loss. It's remembering the way those people moved. At no point did they ever chase us directly. They preferred to remain hidden among the fuselages, appearing for only a few seconds before disappearing again, as though they knew that maze of metal perfectly, and wanted us to understand that we had never truly been alone. Since then, whenever I see photographs of that enormous aircraft boneyard in Arizona, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the abandoned airplanes. It's the possibility that someone may be walking between them at that very moment, watching visitors, without ever having to fully reveal themselves. Story 3. My name is Travis Morgan. I'm 41 years old and I've worked as an industrial electrician for more than a decade. For the last 4 years, I had been part of the maintenance team responsible for a massive solar farm located in a desert region of southern Nevada. The place was so enormous that when you stood at the highest point on the property, all you could see for miles in every direction were rows upon rows of metal structures. Most maintenance work was done during the day, but certain repairs had to be carried out at night to avoid interrupting power generation during peak demand hours. I never liked those night shifts. Not because I believed in ghost stories or anything like that, but because the entire environment changed once the sun went down. Moonlight reflected off the solar panels, creating long corridors that all looked nearly identical. It only took a few minutes of walking to completely lose your sense of direction. The night this happened, I received a work order to inspect a series of inverters that had been experiencing intermittent failures since the beginning of the week. It was a simple job and I was supposed to be completely alone. My supervisor confirmed that before I left the operations base and even joked that I'd probably finish everything before midnight. I grabbed the company pickup truck, checked my tools, my radio, and my headlamp, then drove to the assigned section. When I parked near the maintenance area, I shut off the engine and sat for a few seconds listening to the silence of the desert. A light breeze moved through the metal structures, and there was a constant electrical hum coming from the equipment scattered throughout the solar field. Other than that, there wasn't another sound. The service lights illuminated only the main intersections, leaving most of the corridors lit only by the moon. I started walking toward the inverters while checking the fault codes on the company's tablet. Everything seemed completely normal. I replaced a fuse, restarted one of the units, and was recording the results when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. Far in the distance, between two rows of panels, a white light appeared for a few seconds before disappearing. It looked exactly like the beam of a flashlight pointed toward the ground while someone was walking. I assumed a security guard was making rounds, although that was unusual in that part of the complex. I kept working without giving it much thought. About a minute later, I saw another light. This one appeared in a different corridor and much closer. It moved slowly for several yards before disappearing again. The strange thing was that I knew exactly who was scheduled to be working that night. Besides me, there wasn't another electrician assigned to that shift. I kept staring in that direction for several seconds, waiting for the light to appear again. I grabbed my radio and called dispatch, asking whether a security guard was patrolling that specific section. The answer came almost immediately. The operator told me that the security officer was on the opposite side of the complex, several miles away, overseeing the arrival of a maintenance truck. He also confirmed that I was the only employee authorized to be in that area that night. I thanked him, ended the transmission, and tried convincing myself that I had probably seen the reflection of some distant light bouncing off the solar panels. The problem was that while I tightened the cover on one of the electrical panels, the same light appeared again. This time it wasn't a reflection. It was unmistakably a flashlight moving between two rows of panels, stopping for several seconds before continuing on. I called out loudly, asking if anyone was there. My voice disappeared into the endless metal corridors. No one answered. The light simply went out. The silence returned so quickly that I began doubting what I had just seen. Even so, I finished the repair much faster than I originally intended. I was no longer paying attention only to the equipment. I kept scanning the surrounding corridors, looking for any sign of movement. I packed my tools into my backpack and started walking back toward the pickup, using the same route I had taken earlier. After several minutes, I realized something had changed. One of the service light poles that should have been illuminated was now completely dark. I assumed the bulb might have failed during the maintenance work. Then I noticed it wasn't just one light. An entire row of service lights in that section had been switched off at the same time. The difference was dramatic. The moon still illuminated parts of the solar panels, but several corridors had been plunged into darkness deep enough to completely hide anyone walking between them. I stopped and tried locating my pickup by spotting the reflection on the windshield. I couldn't see it anymore. That's when I heard the first sound. Footsteps. They weren't coming from in front of me or behind me. They seemed to be moving slowly through a corridor parallel to mine, separated only by a single row of solar panels. They were calm, steady, keeping exactly the same pace as my own footsteps. Whenever I stopped, they stopped too. When I took 2 more steps, the footsteps on the other side of the metal structures did exactly the same. I never saw anyone. I only heard someone walking at precisely the same speed I was. I stopped completely just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The wind remained gentle, causing a few of the structures to vibrate slightly, but those footsteps were different. They had rhythm, weight, a cadence impossible to mistake for mechanical noise. I waited nearly 15 seconds without moving. I heard nothing. Then I decided to test it. I walked forward exactly 3 steps and stopped again. 2 seconds later, I heard exactly 3 footsteps matching mine in the next row. My heart immediately started racing. I removed my flashlight from my helmet and shined it over the tops of the panels, but they stood nearly 10 feet high and completely blocked my view. There was no way to see into the parallel corridor without walking all the way to the next intersection. I considered doing exactly that, but quickly dismissed the idea. If someone really was there, I'd only be walking straight toward them. I grabbed the radio again and tried contacting dispatch. This time I heard nothing but loud static. I changed channels, turned the radio off and back on. The interference continued. Then I noticed something else. Farther away, another flashlight beam appeared. Moments later, another one lit up several rows farther down. In less than 10 seconds, I could distinguish at least 3 different lights moving slowly between the solar panels. None of them stayed visible for very long. They appeared for several seconds, then disappeared behind the metal structures. as though whoever was carrying them knew exactly how to avoid remaining exposed. At that moment, I stopped trying to figure out what was happening. My only goal became getting back to my pickup. I opened the company's offline map on the tablet to locate my position and find the shortest route back to the parking area. While walking and occasionally glancing at the screen, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they weren't coming from just one side. Another set of footsteps was now moving through a corridor somewhere behind me. I stopped instantly. Both sounds stopped together. I started walking again. Both sets of footsteps resumed at the exact same time. It felt as though I was being shadowed by different people, each keeping enough distance to remain hidden. When I finally reached a larger intersection, I looked left and saw a flashlight disappear behind the final row of panels. I ran toward it, hoping to finally find someone. There was no one there, only an empty corridor illuminated by moonlight. As I stood there catching my breath, I heard a metallic clank behind me. I spun around and found the access cover of an electrical panel slowly swinging back and forth, as though someone had just let go of it. I didn't see a single person, but I had the unmistakable feeling that someone had been standing there only a second or two before I looked. I took a deep breath and stopped chasing every light I saw. The only thing that mattered now was finding my truck. I continued following the map on the tablet until I realized the position marker had stopped updating. The screen still showed me near the section where I had started the maintenance, even though I had already walked for several minutes. I slipped the tablet into my pocket and decided to navigate using the identification signs mounted on the utility poles. Every corridor had its own code, and I knew that if I reached the main service road, I could find my way back without any trouble. As I walked, I heard a short whistle coming from somewhere to my right. It wasn't the wind. It had clearly been made by a person. A few seconds later, another whistle answered from the opposite direction. My blood instantly ran cold. It sounded as though people were communicating using simple signals without ever needing to raise their voices. I picked up my pace. For the first time that night, I started running. Behind me, the footsteps accelerated too. I never saw anyone, but the sound of boots crunching across the gravel followed me through several corridors. When I finally reached a more open area, I spotted the reflection of my pickup beneath one of the few service lights that was still on. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. Before driving away, I switched on the high beams and illuminated the corridors. There wasn't a single visible person anywhere among the solar panels. I drove straight back to the operations base and told my supervisor and the security team everything that had happened. At first, they assumed I had encountered trespassers trying to steal copper wiring, something that occasionally happened at isolated facilities. A security team returned with me only a few minutes later and searched the exact same section. They found the entire row of service lights had been manually switched off at the distribution panel, something that could only have been done by someone with access to the equipment. They also found several sets of fresh footprints in the gravel between the rows of panels, but the tracks disappeared wherever the ground became hard again, making it impossible to determine where they had gone. They never found any people or any vehicles inside the complex that night. A few days later, I spoke with one of the security guards who had worked there for many years. Before I even explained the details, he asked, "So, you saw the flashlights too?" He told me that from time to time, employees working the night shift reported seeing lights moving between the solar panels and hearing people walking through the corridors without ever finding anyone. Officially, every incident was always explained as trespassers escaping before security arrived. Maybe that's exactly what it was, but even today, whenever I remember those whistles answering one another and those footsteps matching every movement I made, I'm still convinced that there were more people in that solar field that night than anyone at the company ever realized. Story 4. My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm 34 years old and I live in Fort Collins, Colorado. My wife Emily and I always liked using long road trips as an opportunity to visit historic places that most people would never notice if they simply stayed on the main highway. In early fall of 2024, we decided to spend a few days driving through Utah without any particular schedule, stopping at state parks and small towns along the way. The morning this happened, we were heading toward Moab when we saw a sign pointing to a preserved old mining town just a few miles off the highway. Emily had seen pictures of the place online and insisted we make a quick detour. It sounded like a good idea. The site was known for its well-preserved 19th century buildings and for receiving a small number of visitors during the day. We turned onto the dirt road, drove for about 20 minutes through the desert, and finally saw the first wooden buildings appearing between dry hills and reddish rock formations. There was a small makeshift parking area at the entrance to the town. Only an old pickup truck was parked there with no one around. We assumed the occupants were walking among the buildings. We grabbed our water bottles, my camera, and started exploring the main street, figuring we'd stay there for no more than an hour before continuing our trip. The town was much better preserved than I expected. Most of the buildings still had nearly intact facades, with old signs identifying the barber shop, the general store, the post office, and a small two-story hotel at the end of the street. The silence was absolute. There wasn't enough wind to make the doors creak, and there wasn't a single bird nearby. As we walked, we kept commenting on how strange it was that a place that large felt completely deserted. It was near the hotel that we noticed the first thing that seemed out of place. The front door was open, not just unlocked, but standing completely wide open as though someone had just walked in or out. I assumed there might be historical preservation workers inside the building, so we stepped in while calling out to see if anyone was there. No one answered. The lobby was covered in dust, but near the old reception desk there were unmistakable signs of recent activity. On a table sat 2 opened cans of food, a pot that was still warm, and a metal mug half full of coffee. In one corner of the room, a small makeshift stove built from bricks still released a thin column of smoke. The firewood hadn't burned out long ago. Someone had been there only minutes before we arrived. The 2 of us stood there staring at the scene for several seconds. Emily was the first to say that someone was probably living there in secret. That made far more sense than anything else. In many parts of the American West, people live inside abandoned buildings, especially in isolated places. Even so, I thought it was strange that there wasn't the slightest sign of whoever had prepared that meal. I called out loudly, asking whether anyone was inside the hotel. My voice echoed through the wooden hallways upstairs, but no one answered. The smell of smoke mixed with coffee still lingered in the air, as though the stove had been used only a few minutes earlier. We walked only as far as the staircase before deciding not to go upstairs. It felt like invading someone's privacy, even if we were inside an abandoned historic building. We stepped back outside onto the main street and started paying closer attention to the other buildings. That's when we realized the hotel wasn't the only place showing signs of recent use. The door to the old general store was also open. Behind the building were fresh tire tracks in the sand and a tarp stretched between 2 walls, forming a makeshift shelter. We didn't see anyone, but it no longer felt like an abandoned town. It felt like a place where people were quietly living and didn't want visitors wandering around. After a few more minutes, we agreed that we'd seen enough and that it would be better to leave without exploring any further. We walked back toward the parking area, talking about how we should probably notify whoever managed the site that people were occupying some of the buildings. When we finally spotted our SUV, I immediately felt that something looked wrong. It took me several seconds to understand why. As we got closer, I felt my stomach drop. The right side of the vehicle was resting directly on a hydraulic jack. Both wheels on that side were gone. There were no slashed tires, no scattered parts. The wheels had been carefully removed. The lug nuts had been neatly stacked on the ground, as though someone had calmly taken them off using the proper tools. I immediately looked around for anyone nearby. The parking area was still empty. The old pickup truck we'd seen when we arrived had disappeared. While I was still trying to understand how someone could remove 2 wheels without us hearing a single sound, Emily grabbed my arm tightly and pointed toward the 2nd floor of the old hotel. Someone was standing behind one of the broken windows, looking directly at us. Before I could react, another silhouette appeared in the window of the building next door. I looked back toward the hotel window, trying to get a better look at the person's face. But the inside of the building was far darker than the bright sunlight outside. All I could make out was a completely motionless silhouette. Then another one appeared in the old barber shop across the street. Then another in the 2nd floor window of what had once been the mining office. None of them gestured. None of them moved. They simply stood there looking at us. The strangest part was that throughout the entire time we'd been walking around town, those windows had been empty. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave any of the buildings. Emily whispered that we should grab the phone and call the police immediately. I pulled my phone from my pocket. No signal. We had expected that because we were so far from the highway, but at that moment it stopped being a simple inconvenience. I opened the rear cargo compartment looking for the spare tire and the tools. The spare was still there, but it would have been impossible to put the vehicle back on 4 wheels without the 2 missing ones. As I tried figuring out what to do, I heard a wooden door creak behind us. I turned around immediately. A man had just stepped out of the old hotel and was slowly walking along the sidewalk. He wasn't looking directly at us. His head remained lowered, and he walked in complete silence. Moments later, another person appeared farther down the street, emerging from the general store. Within seconds, I realized that the people we'd seen standing in the windows were beginning to leave the buildings, one at a time, without running, and without saying a single word. I didn't wait to find out what they intended to do. I got inside the SUV, locked the doors, and started the engine, just to keep the air conditioning running while I tried to think of a way out. The dirt road was directly ahead, but the vehicle wouldn't make it more than a few feet, resting only on the wheels on the left side. Emily suggested that I keep honking the horn, hoping someone passing on the main highway might hear it, even though we both knew the highway was miles away. I did exactly that. Several times, the sound echoed through the town, and then silence returned. The people kept walking slowly. None of them seemed to be in any hurry. They simply shortened the distance between themselves and us while remaining spread throughout the street. I counted at least 6 people, maybe 7. Each of them stayed several yards away from the others as though they were accustomed to doing this. Then I noticed something that worried me even more. None of them was carrying our wheels. If they were the ones who had removed them, then they had hidden the wheels somewhere before revealing themselves. That meant removing them hadn't been a spontaneous act. Someone had planned to keep us from leaving before deciding to approach us. I kept honking the horn for several minutes while alternating between watching the street and trying to get a signal on my phone. The people never answered, never shouted, never quickened their pace. They simply kept watching us. A few minutes later, we heard the sound of an engine approaching from the access road. I've never been so relieved to hear a vehicle in my life. A white park administration pickup truck came into town, kicking up dust as it drove. The moment it appeared, something happened that I still have trouble forgetting. The people simply began disappearing back into the buildings. They didn't run. They just walked into the nearest structures, one after another, until the street was completely empty again. 2 employees got out of the truck and asked if everything was all right. I quickly explained that someone had removed 2 wheels from our vehicle, and that several people had been moving among the buildings. The 2 employees exchanged an uneasy look before calling another ranger over the radio. Less than 15 minutes later, they found both of our wheels hidden behind an old maintenance shed beneath a tarp. The lug nuts had been placed inside an empty paint can sitting beside them. Whoever had done it had clearly taken enough time to carefully remove everything and hide the parts before we returned to the parking area. While one of the employees reinstalled the wheels, I asked who those people were. The answer was brief. He explained that from time to time, groups temporarily occupied some of the abandoned buildings in the town, without authorization. Whenever they noticed visitors arriving, they usually hid to avoid contact. They never confirmed whether it was always the same people, but admitted that they had found makeshift stoves, food, mattresses, and clothing inside several of the historic buildings. They also said that some visitors had reported feeling as though they were being watched while walking through the town. The police documented our case as theft and vandalism, but no one was ever identified. To this day, I still don't know why they removed exactly 2 wheels instead of simply stealing our belongings, or even the vehicle itself. The only conclusion I've ever been able to reach is that someone wanted to make sure we couldn't leave, once we realized the town wasn't nearly as abandoned as it appeared. Since then, whenever I watch videos of tourists exploring old ghost towns in the desert, I don't think the empty buildings are the most unsettling part of those places. Sometimes, the real problem isn't what was left behind, but who decided to stay. Story 5. My name is Brian Sullivan. I'm 46 years old and I teach astronomy at a community college in northern New Mexico. I've always enjoyed organizing small field trips with students who showed a genuine interest in the subject. They weren't official college events, just informal gatherings to watch meteor showers, eclipses, or any other celestial event worth seeing. On that weekend in October 2023, 2 of my most dedicated students, Lucas Bennett and Megan Foster, asked if I knew a place with very little light pollution where we could watch a meteor shower that was expected later that night. I suggested an area near an old abandoned observatory located on top of a mountain, surrounded by desert. I had been there several years earlier, and remembered that although the building had been closed for a long time, the access road was still open up to a small parking area used by visitors. We left Santa Fe early that evening and drove for a little over 2 hours. As we climbed the mountain, the lights from the towns disappeared completely. The sky was perfectly clear, the air was cold and dry, and thousands of stars were visible to the naked eye. When we reached the parking area, there wasn't another vehicle in sight. It seemed like exactly the kind of peaceful place I was looking for. We set up our tripods a short distance away from the truck and spent about an hour observing the sky and talking about the constellations. The temperature kept dropping, so every now and then we'd return to the vehicle to grab another jacket or pour ourselves some coffee. The old observatory sat slightly above us at the top of a small hill. Even from a distance, we could clearly make out the silhouette of the main tower illuminated only by the moon. At one point, while I was adjusting one of the telescopes, Megan asked whether anyone was using the building that night. I looked in the direction she pointed and saw a white light briefly switch on inside the tower. It lasted only 2 or 3 seconds before disappearing. I assumed it might have been the reflection of a satellite or perhaps distant headlights shining through a broken window. I continued talking as though nothing had happened. Less than a minute later, the same light appeared again in exactly the same spot. This time Lucas saw it too. The three of us watched in silence as it appeared for a third time, remained visible for several seconds, and then disappeared again. It didn't make any sense. I knew the observatory had officially been closed for years, and I had never heard of any authorized nighttime visits. The three of us continued watching the tower for several minutes, waiting to see if the light would appear again. It did, twice more, always from the same location, as though someone were walking around the main room with a flashlight. Lucas suggested that perhaps a group of amateur astronomers had obtained permission to use the building. It was a reasonable theory. I'd taken part in similar events myself years earlier. Even so, I thought it was strange that there wasn't another vehicle parked there besides ours. If there really were other people inside, they had to have arrived somehow. After a brief discussion, we decided to walk up there simply to let them know we were observing the sky nearby and to make sure there wasn't any problem with us staying in the area. The walk was short, less than 10 minutes along a dirt and rock trail. As we got closer to the building, it looked even more abandoned than I remembered. The windows were broken. Much of the paint had completely peeled away. The metal telescope dome was covered with large patches of rust. The front door stood slightly open. I called out several times asking if anyone was inside. No one answered. The silence was so complete that we could hear the wind blowing through cracks in the structure. We stepped only a few feet inside, lighting the interior with our flashlights. The first room was covered in dust, but there were unmistakable signs that someone was using the place. In one corner was a thin mattress resting on wooden pallets. Nearby, we found folded blankets, several empty food cans, water jugs, piles of clothing, and a makeshift workbench built from wooden crates. Inside what had once been the observatory's main room, we found electrical cables scattered across the floor, car batteries connected to a power inverter, and a rechargeable flashlight still plugged into its charger. Everything was neatly arranged, as though someone had been living there for quite some time. The detail that caught my attention most was a pot resting on a small portable camping stove. It was still warm. I gently touched the side and could clearly feel the heat. That meant whoever had been there had left only a short time earlier. I immediately looked at Lucas and Megan and said it would be better if we left without exploring any further. Before we had even finished walking out of the room, we heard a sharp sound outside, like a rock sliding down the hillside just behind the building. None of us said a word. We simply quickened our pace toward the trail leading back to the truck. We walked down the trail without running, but much faster than we had climbed it. Every few moments I looked back, trying to spot something among the rocks and low shrubs illuminated by the moon. The wind had almost completely died down, making every sound stand out. We were about halfway back when we heard another rock rolling downhill. This time the sound clearly came from behind us. I stopped briefly and shined my flashlight up the slope. I didn't see anyone. I assumed it might have been an animal, perhaps a coyote or a deer crossing the hillside. I continued walking, trying to remain calm. Only a few seconds later, it happened again. Another series of small rocks rolled down the slope, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on loose gravel. They were quick at first, then slowed down whenever we slowed down. Lucas looked at me and quietly asked if I could hear it too. I simply nodded. I didn't want to start a discussion in the middle of the trail. I grabbed the handheld radio I usually carried on field trips, even though I knew it would only work with another identical unit, and kept it in my hand more out of habit than usefulness. The parking area was already visible between the low trees, but the feeling that someone was coming down the mountain behind us only grew stronger. When we finally reached the flatter section of the trail, Megan grabbed my arm and quietly pointed uphill without saying a word. I looked where she was pointing and saw a silhouette standing near the rocks, exactly where the trail made its final turn before reaching the observatory. The person was too far away for us to make out any details beyond the outline of their body. They remained perfectly still for several seconds. Then they took 2 steps forward and disappeared behind a rock formation. All 3 of us immediately picked up our pace. We didn't run because the ground was covered with loose rocks, but we were walking as fast as we could without looking anywhere except ahead. That's when we heard the gravel shifting again. This time, the sound was much closer. I quickly swung my flashlight behind us and managed to illuminate only the reflection of something metallic, disappearing behind a bush. I don't know whether it was a belt buckle, a flashlight, or some other object attached to someone's clothing. What I do know is that someone was using the darkness of the mountain to remain hidden while steadily closing the distance between us. From that moment on, our only goal was reaching the truck before that distance disappeared completely. We reached the parking area almost at the same time. Lucas jumped into the passenger seat. Megan climbed into the back. I unlocked the truck in such a hurry that I dropped my flashlight on the ground before managing to start the engine. While fumbling with the key in the ignition, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the silhouette appear again at the beginning of the trail. The person wasn't running. They were walking slowly, at exactly the same steady pace. I switched on the high beams and aimed them directly toward the trail, hoping to finally see who it was. The person immediately stopped behind a large boulder. They remained hidden well enough that only part of a shoulder and their head became visible for a moment. I shifted into reverse and started backing out of the parking area without taking the headlights off that spot. At that moment, I heard a loud impact against the side of the truck. I instinctively stopped, thinking I had driven over a large rock. Lucas looked out the window and said someone had thrown a rock at the rear door. Before I could confirm it, another rock struck the ground only a few feet in front of the truck. These weren't rocks naturally rolling down the hillside. They were being thrown. I accelerated immediately and drove down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't slow down until we were back on the paved highway several miles away from the mountain. The following day, I contacted the agency responsible for managing the area to report what we had found inside the observatory. The employee I spoke with thanked me for the information and said that, unfortunately, situations like that weren't entirely uncommon. According to him, people occasionally managed to get inside the abandoned building and remained hidden there for days or even weeks before being discovered. Maintenance crews had previously found mattresses, food, batteries, camping stoves, and other signs of occupancy on several different occasions. When I told him we had seen a light repeatedly appearing inside the tower and that someone had apparently followed us down the trail, he simply replied that they would send another security patrol to inspect the site. I never received any follow-up explaining what they found. To this day, I still take students out to observe the night sky, but I've never returned to that mountain. Whenever someone suggests visiting abandoned observatories to photograph the stars, I always think back to that night. What has stayed with me the most isn't the light inside the tower or the makeshift living space. It's the way that person waited until we left the building before beginning to follow us, using the darkness, the rough terrain, and the silence of the mountain to stay close enough, without ever having to show their face. Story 6. My name is Adam Foster. I'm 39 years old and I work as a geologist for a small environmental consulting company in California. Much of my job involves traveling to remote areas to document rock formations, collect samples, and prepare reports for universities or mining companies. I've always enjoyed this kind of work because I'd rather spend an entire day in the desert than inside an office. In late spring of 2024, I was assigned to document several old mineral formations in a little visited section of the Mojave Desert. It wasn't an official mining expedition, just a geological survey for an academic study. Since the sampling sites were spread across dozens of miles, I decided to do the work alone, bringing plenty of water, extra fuel, emergency equipment, and a satellite phone in case I needed it. I spent the entire day driving along dirt tracks and hiking among dark rocky hills under the intense desert heat. By the time I finished collecting the last sample, the sun was already very low in the sky. My plan was to reach a main road before it got completely dark. But a detour through rough terrain forced me to continue through a valley I didn't know very well. It was during that drive that I came across something I definitely wasn't expecting to find. In the middle of the valley was a small campsite set up between large rock formations. It wasn't a tourist campsite. There were two discrete sand-colored tents, a tarp stretched between several rocks to form a shelter, and a folding table covered with open geological maps. As soon as I stopped my pickup truck, I assumed I had found another team of geologists working in the area. I got out and called for someone. No one answered. The place appeared completely deserted. Even so, everything suggested that the occupants had left only minutes earlier. A pot was still warm on top of a small camping stove. Beside it, I found disposable plates with half-eaten food, 2 mugs still full of coffee, and an open thermos. There were also professional geological hammers, handheld metal detectors, high-end GPS units, and several maps covered with handwritten notes. None of it looked abandoned. The strangest part was that there were no fresh footprints leading away from the campsite into the open valley. It looked as though the people had simply disappeared among the surrounding rocks. The first thing I thought was that some kind of accident might have happened. The second was that perhaps the group had been involved in something illegal and had hurried away when they heard my truck approaching. I stood there for several minutes trying to decide what to do. I had no intention of touching anyone else's belongings. At the same time, the campsite didn't seem consistent with an ordinary research project. The equipment was expensive. There was freshly prepared food, tools scattered around, and no one responded when I called out. I pulled out my satellite phone to contact my supervisor, but the device struggled to establish a connection inside that valley, surrounded by rock formations. While I waited, I decided to take a few photographs of the campsite to document exactly how I had found it. I figured that if something really was wrong, the photographs might be useful for the authorities later. I photographed the table with the maps, the equipment, and the tents without going inside any of them. On one of the maps, I noticed several markings circling old abandoned mining sites that didn't even appear on the tourist maps of the region. There were also handwritten coordinates and several small symbols I didn't recognize. The longer I looked, the more it seemed that these people were searching for something very specific in the desert. That's when I heard a short whistle coming from the rocks behind the campsite. I immediately looked up. The sound was clear but very brief. I waited several seconds thinking it might have been a bird. Moments later, I heard another whistle, this time coming from a completely different direction. It didn't sound like an animal. It had the rhythm of someone trying to get another person's attention without raising their voice. I remained completely still, trying to determine where the sounds were coming from. The desert was beginning to grow dark, and the shadows between the rocks made it difficult to see very far. Holding my camera, I slowly turned in a full circle around the campsite. That's when a small flash caught my attention near the top of a rocky ridge. At first, I thought it was simply the setting sun reflecting off a pale rock. A second later, another flash appeared a few yards away, then another. I blinked several times, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I realized the reflections shifted position at the same time that small silhouettes moved behind the rocks. They weren't rocks, they were lenses. Binoculars pointed directly at me. I counted at least 4 different reflections before one disappeared behind a larger boulder. My stomach immediately tightened. The occupants had never abandoned the campsite. They were spread out among the rock formations, watching every move I made from the moment I parked my truck. Those whistles had almost certainly never been random. They were using them to communicate while waiting for me to enter the campsite. At that moment, I stopped taking photographs and slowly lowered the camera. I knew that any sudden movement could easily be misunderstood. I kept staring toward the surrounding rocks, trying to determine whether there really were people there, or whether my mind was turning a few reflections into something much bigger. It didn't take long to find out. One pair of binoculars reflected the last light of the setting sun again, and just below them I could make out the outline of a man crouching behind a boulder. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He simply continued watching me. A few seconds later, I heard another short whistle, this time much closer. A reply immediately came from the opposite side of the valley. Their communication was unmistakable. I slowly placed the camera back into my backpack without taking my eyes off the rocks. My pickup truck was parked about 40 yards away. It wasn't a great distance, but the ground between the campsite and the vehicle was completely open. I would have to walk, knowing that several people were watching every step I took. I slowly backed away, keeping my hands visible and avoiding any movement that could appear threatening. As I did, I noticed small movements appearing among different rock formations. No one ever stepped fully into view. I caught glimpses of only part of a shoulder, the brim of a cap or the barrel of a pair of binoculars before they disappeared again. It became obvious that they knew that terrain far better than I did, and they intended to remain hidden. I managed to reach the truck without running. The moment I opened the door, I climbed inside, started the engine, and locked the doors. Before driving away, I looked one last time toward the campsite through the headlights that were beginning to illuminate the valley. That's when I realized some of those men were no longer on the rocks where I had first seen them. They had changed positions without me noticing. One of them appeared for only a second while crossing between two rock formations, carrying something long in his hands that I couldn't identify. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I shifted into gear and began following the only trail leading out of the valley. After driving only a few hundred yards, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw two flashlights switch on almost simultaneously high among the rocks, following the direction I was traveling. They didn't chase the truck. Instead, they remained visible for several minutes, as though confirming that I really was leaving the area. I didn't relax until I reached a wider dirt road where I finally managed to establish a connection with my satellite phone. As soon as I had a signal on the satellite phone, I contacted my company's office and explained exactly what I had found. My supervisor told me not to return to the valley under any circumstances and instructed me to notify the local authorities as soon as I reached an area with normal cell service. I did exactly that later that night after arriving in a small town at the edge of the desert. The following day, I was interviewed by an agent from the office responsible for that region. I handed over every photograph I had taken of the campsite, including the images of the maps, the tools, and the table. A few days later, the same agent contacted me to thank me for the information. He didn't go into details, but he confirmed that a team had located the campsite exactly where I had described it. When they arrived, however, they found no one there. The tents, camping stoves, equipment, and nearly every object had already disappeared. The only things left behind were fresh tire tracks and several spots where the ground clearly showed that structures had been dismantled only hours earlier. They never told me who those people were, but they repeatedly asked whether I had seen prospecting equipment or maps marked with old mining sites. Apparently, there had already been other similar incidents in that area. To this day, I believe I was lucky to understand so quickly what those whistles meant. At first, I thought they were birds or simply the wind moving through the rocks. Then I realized they were signals exchanged between people watching me without any intention of revealing themselves. What stayed with me most wasn't discovering a hidden campsite in the middle of the Mojave. Remote places tend to attract all kinds of people. What I've never been able to forget was looking up and seeing multiple pairs of binoculars reflecting sunlight directly at me all at once. While I walked around believing I was completely alone, someone was watching every step I took, every photograph I captured, and every move I made. I'll never know whether they simply intended to wait for me to leave, or whether they were deciding what to do if I stayed any longer. Since then, I've continued working as a geologist, but I've established one rule that I've never broken. If I come across an apparently abandoned campsite in a remote area, I leave immediately. Some people leave a place empty because they've gone. Others leave a place empty because they prefer to watch whoever has just arrived first.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.